Good morning. My name is Henry Besaidnout. I'm of the International Trade Program here at Northwest University, and today we are hosting Professor David Luke, all the way from the London School of Economics. Now, he's got a very long and detailed, illustrious career, and so I'm going to leave it over to Professor Luke here to really give us sort of a quick background and introduce himself. And tell us how you got to the London School of Economics and what are you currently doing there?
Sure. Well, thank you, Henry, and thanks also for having me in this podcast. I'm really looking forward to the conversation with you. Yes, as you say, I'm David Luke. I'm currently a professor at the London School of Economics in the UK. How I got there is that I studied there as an undergraduate and also as a master's student. Following which I went to the School of Oriental and African Studies for my doctorate in African political economy, and then did go into academia for a while in Canada. I taught for several years in Canada, then joined the United Nations and went all over the world, literally, with the United Nations, working on trade issues as a trade advisor and doing trade policy analysis. And then now, after over 2 decades in the United Nations, I'm back in the London School of Economics, not as a student this time, but as a professor and leading a program on African trade policy, as well as teaching a course on trade policy and development. But I'm also deeply honored to have been appointed an extraordinary professor here at Northwest University. And it's in that context I'm here visiting Northwest. And I've been delighted to meet so many other colleagues working on trade issues and to have some really very stimulating conversations with them, and including yourself yesterday, Henry. One of the things I think I'm going to take away from my visit to Northwest is how relaxed you guys are. But then when the sun is shining, as it does here in the South African summer, you can expect people to be quite relaxed and so on. But I've enjoyed every moment I'm here. And now looking forward to this conversation with you in the next hour or so.
So welcome and thank you for giving us your time. I think one of the first questions that come to mind is, you've really seen it all, to say the good, the bad, and the ugly, all the way from Thatcher and Reagan through to Biden and Trump, and currently Prime Minister Starmer. If you think about the role of trade policy, which you are specialized in, how has that evolved over time?
I think in many ways, of course, thinking of trade in the global economy, much has changed in the global economy. Technology has changed. Communications have changed in all sorts of ways. Digitalization, all sorts of impacts. The climate, of course, that we're concerned with. But I think that certain things have remained the same. And this is what really I've been trying to understand and to study more deeply. And that is trade, irrespective of the changes around us, is actually the driver of wealth, of prosperity, of economic growth. And thinking about the African continent, inevitably trade is extremely important for African economies because I have always said African economies don't have a plan B. They only have a plan A, and that plan A is to grow their trade. So, in spite of all the changes, trade remains the same. It's never changed. What the classical economists like Adam Smith and Ricardo taught us about the goal of trade, I think that remains the same despite all the changes that we see around us.
Okay, so I want to quickly go off script because after we spoken yesterday, last night, I actually saw a analysis from, I think it's somebody at the World Bank, I'm not sure, but he's from the DRC. And he spoke about the current situation in the DRC and what everybody was expecting. And then along comes everybody's favorite person, Donald Trump, and I say he completely rewrites the script. Because the traditional approach was support the rebels, get the minerals, until the rebels don't suit you, then you support the new rebels. And where everybody thought that President Trump would support the M23 rebels, he very clearly took a line against them and offered the DRC government lots of support. But like with the Ukraine situation, there's a caveat in terms of we want access to resources. What would be your take on this move?
Yeah, I think the situation in the DRC is very tragic. Actually, just like you were reading something last night, so was I, and the fire in Goma and people who lost their lives, or people who have been severely affected and so on. I also saw. On the news, one of the ladies who had been severely burnt and in that tragedy. So, a country with a long history of all these tragedies, which in a sense is so ironical because it's also such a rich country in terms of its natural resources. Um, Again, to come back to sort of the theme of our discussion this morning, which is trade, people do change sides again in order to get advantage on trade. So whether it's the M23 or the DRC government, I mean, this is all about how they could, whether it's the US or any other country that's interested in the DRC, how best to position themselves. But I think, I know as we are all frustrated with some of the things that Trump says and does and so on. But from time to time, one tries to understand what's the logic behind this. And here, at least, my own view would be that you try to support the government that's in place. It's a legitimate government. He was elected, even if the elections some say were flawed. But having another state basically cross borders to invade another one, in whatever form, backing a rebel movement or whatever. But that's what we understand is going on in the DRC, with Rwanda playing a role, and others actually, Ugandans as well. I think that we would all agree that preserving the territorial integrity of countries, according to what international law says, is the way to go. You can say this for the DRC and the support for the DRC government. You can say this for Ukraine and so on. If we don't draw the line somewhere, there would be total chaos. So from that point of view, at least this is something we can applaud Trump for, even if in other areas he leads us to despair.
I think we're running way ahead of ourselves, but part of the argumentation of that is President Trump really insisted on America developing the Luanda-Lubumbashi corridor, the rail track and the connections, obviously for the extraction of minerals, but that then competes with the Chinese interest trying to get it to the East Coast. That is, of course, getting it to the Atlantic coast, but the question is a new set of infrastructure and supporting jobs and stuff will be created. So I think bringing it back to trade policy, especially in Africa where we need infrastructure and we need development, how do you see using the mineral wealth of Africa to develop that infrastructure and create the opportunities?
Yeah. This is a very loaded question that you've asked. I think, so because of the kind of era that we're in now, this sort of world order in which you have, great powers that are rising, not just one superpower in the United States and so on, but we're seeing greater economic nationalism, greater transactionalism in the way countries are interacting with each other and so on. I think this is a context in which African countries need to look to see what is in their own interests as well. having these minerals that are now needed for the climate transition and important also for advancing the digital economy and all this is obviously a blessing. But I think they have to be very intentional and themselves transactional in the way that they engage with others, recognizing that you have to engage because you don't have the technology. You don't have the capital investment and so on. So you've got to strike a balance, but at the same time, as you rightly point out, you want jobs, you want to grow, you want the infrastructure, you want various other things. So I think African countries really have to be strategic, strike the right bargain with partners, recognizing that it is a transaction from two sides. And here, since also trade is our theme, I was recently approached by a journalist from African Business Magazine who was asking if the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, if it's not renewed, what would be the reaction in Africa? So, my response was that, yes, we see some uncertainty as to whether or not AGOA would be renewed, but that it's not a one-way street. The African sides also have some cards to play. And you just mentioned the Lobito corridor, but there are other places in Africa as well, including here in South Africa, which has the world's largest reserves of platinum. Which is another critical mineral. So I think in this transactional context, each country needs to play its cards as well as it could, and try to ensure that you're trying to get something for the renewal of AGOA in exchange for something else. So you have to do this, but also for the Africans, I think they have to do this collectively because the economic weight is relatively small, as you know, and trying to go alone to deal with big powers, just given the asymmetries and all this, is not the way to go. So they have to try to speak with one voice, as you say in these things. But it's not a one-way street. They have to look at what assets they can bring to the table and how to be transactional in their negotiations.
There's sort of two things that stand out. The one side you sort of mentioned going together, so we're talking about the All African Free Trade Agreement and AGOA on the one side. So I think AGOA is the shorter part, so let's finish that first.
Yeah, okay.
Because as far as I understand it, but I'd like your comments, Trump 2.0, as they say, no longer refers to Africa as whole countries.
No.
But it's obviously clear that he really has picked a fight with South Africa. So from where I stand, it looks like AGOA will most likely be renewed, but South Africa will not be part of that. How do you interpret it?
Let's see how that plays out. I would hope that the Africans would be stand in solidarity with South Africa. I think politically it would be a miscalculation to enter into AGOA without South Africa. Because this sort of divide and rule kind of thing would bounce back and affect African countries in other ways and in other arenas and so on. So my hope would be that everybody stands in solidarity to say that if South Africa is being kicked out, then we don't want it. Let's look at another way of having a trade deal. And I think that will send a very powerful message. But if South Africa is kicked out and the guys say, oh, that's fine, we'll go along with it, I think in the long term it's not in their interest. And I think that if the Americans don't want to renew AGOA, I see some scenarios that Africans could put on the table. The first thing would be to say, look, renew it on a temporary basis, then let's negotiate an FTA, a free trade agreement, with the whole continent, not with individual countries. And I'll come back to this, why they should go in that direction. And that will buy time. It's going to take a long time to negotiate an agreement. As you know, it can't be done overnight. It's not even clear whether the U.S. Congress would give Trump the authority to negotiate an agreement, because you know the U.S. Congress has to explicitly agree whether the how the dynamics of that would excuse me, how the dynamics of that will play out in the Congress, we don't yet know, and so on. But it will buy time for the Africans to say that yes, let's do something different, but let's maintain what we have until we can get to another place. And so I think also what Africans should be looking for if they have to go into a free trade agreement with the U.S. is to say that the economies are symmetrical, that you can't have full reciprocity. And I think Trump is a businessman. He would understand that. That when countries are saying that, look at your GDP, look at ours. We cannot just open everything up to you because we'll never be able to grow. So I think he would understand that, and I suspect the Americans would understand that. But at the same time, they would be getting some degree of access to African markets, which is what Trump wants. My sense is that he's not that difficult to satisfy. I think I think you see an ego standing out there. So as long as you're giving him something where he can claim victory. So I think also we have to be smart on this, how we engage. So I think that's possible. And the reason why I say an FTA, if you look at what the kind of trade policy Europe has with Africa, you find that Europe has all these different agreements which will lead to all these different regulatory issues and it does affect African countries if we want to actually integrate the continent. So again, having a continental agreement, I think, would help to shape Africa as an economic bloc, which we are not at this point in time. We've unfortunately not had the leadership either from South Africa or from Nigeria or any of the other big countries to shape the continent into an economic bloc. It has not happened. So this might be an opportunity for that to emerge. So, so we'll look to see how things will unfold. But from the premise of your question, I think there's doubt, of course, as to whether AGOA will be renewed. So we'll have to see how that emerges.
I just want to wrap up the AGOA part of the discussion, because it's just a one-sided declaration from the United States. Africa doesn't have any say in it. So there are people, of course, saying, oh, that is America being altruistic, and other people saying it's America sort of taking control. Do you think AGOA, for all the benefit that it might have had, skew development in terms of trade in Africa?
No, I don't think so. I think for me, firstly, let's agree, because again, I think this is what you're getting at, that the Africans have not benefited as much as they should have from AGOA, because apart from South Africa and a few other countries, Kenya, Lesotho, and a few others that actually had the capacity to export to the US, most of the other African countries really send very minimal exports and so on. But I think that highlights the problem. The problem then is you cannot have a trade deal on the one side without looking at investment on the other side, because it's the other side of the coin. The reason why South Africa, Kenya, Lesotho, and now Ethiopia, others who benefited from AGOA, is because they did receive the investment in the South African auto sector, Kenya textile and clothing, the same with Ethiopia, Lesotho, and so on. So you do need the investment. So I think go expose that that weakness, that these partnerships should not just be about market access and market opening. You can open the market, but if I don't have something to send when you open the market, we're not going to benefit. So I think also the African countries in sort of the negotiations with the US should be putting these sorts of things on the table, and they should also be saying that this is not just charity. This is in everybody's interest, not only the trade flows, but for peace, for stability on the African continent, for immigration out of the African continent, which has become a big issue in Europe, but also in the US and around the world. Everybody's looking at migration and all these things. The African youth, the population which is growing, unemployment, that you cannot. It's not a sustainable situation for Africa to be left behind in this way. So it's in everybody's interest to move in that direction. But you have to have African leaders who are articulating these points, not just for the advantage of their own country, but looking at the bigger picture. And unfortunately, this is what sometimes is not coming out as clearly as I think it should.
Yeah, I want to get to the All African Free Trade Agreement, but you also now mentioned African leaders. I think let's talk about the free trade first. Is the concept of the All African Free Trade Agreement viable? Because if all the trade studies that I've read, there is really a West Africa, sort of North Africa, not just MENA, as most people want to call it, but Egypt to Morocco forms their own little group. The East African Union worked until they included the DRC and South Sudan. And SADC is basically in a dysfunctional family for 20 years. Now, putting all that together, is it really viable, or shouldn't there sort of at least be 5 specific regions? Because Africa is actually a really huge continent.
Yeah.
And first try to integrate that. I think at the back of my mind is always that, the model is always the European Union. But the European Union developed generically out of the ashes of the Second World War, step by step, progressively integrating. It wasn't a top-down decision. I think ASEAN is probably the only top-down one that remotely
has worked,
looks like it's working. And it's also not always working, but I think the face-saving culture at least keeps it going along. So if we come back to Africa, is it not too much to expect in the first? I think Lawrence Edwards from UCT did a paper where they sort of collected data in carrying a container by road from capital of Cameroon, I'll never forget the name,
Yaoundé or whatever,
all the way to Accra.
Yeah.
And they found that it averaged $7 per kilometer in corruption that it costs you. It was actually cheaper to ship it to South Africa, put it on another ship and ship it back to Ghana. And that is something that, I don't know how you're going to change that. So a much more focused idea. So I just want to throw it out there.
Sure, yeah.
I think you've got the insights.
No. Again, Henry, I think, you're raising issues which many people have thought about and continue to think about and so on. But first, let me agree with your point that Africa is a massive continent. It's actually 30 million square kilometers. And the way it is sometimes depicted on the map of the map of the globe is really very funny, because it usually shrinks Africa and then expands the others. But it's a massive continent, so no question about that. And when you're dealing with that size, what are the challenges of economic integration? And I think that's partly what you're alluding to here. How might it be? How you might go about it? I think firstly, the regions have, to a large extent, liberalized trade. is working, I say to a large extent, because it's not working as well as it should. We know that arbitrary decisions can be taken overnight. But, that's always been the nature of trade, where short-term political pressures can lead to arbitrary decisions being taken to block even specific products and so on, because just by fiat. And then, to retreat, at a point in time. So we see all these things happening. So trade within the regions has been largely liberalized. So if you're looking at SADC, you're looking at EAC, as you mentioned, COMESA, ECOWAS, even in the North African countries, their own little club that they have there, at least, they say lower tariffs and so on. The problem, of course, as you also allude to, is the non-tariff barriers, whether in the form of corruption or customs-related issues and so on. And I'll come to this in a moment. But the problem that African countries have is that despite having liberalized on a regional basis, you're still talking about very tiny economies. So you look at the ECOWAS, you look at ESC, even SADC, which, of course, South Africa, the rest of SADC is not, I would say, is probably about 50 or 60% of the South African economy. Okay? And the other economies are really very small. The issue is that you still don't have the scale that you need to transform economies, even in these regional economic communities. And you see this play out in many ways. I'll just give you one example, and I'll come to ASEAN and the top-down approaches and all these points that you raised. But let me give you this example. If you want to just take air travel between any two African countries, somebody just gave me an example of traveling from Cameroon to Gabon, which costs $800 return. Cameroon to the Gabon for a 1 hour flight, $800. But why? The reason is that you don't have the scale, and without the scale, also you don't have the competition. So the prices go up. As economists, we know that. We know that if demand or if the supply is let me get this right. If the supply is fixed and the demand is also low, then the price would go up. I'm just trying to imagine it in the sort of graphs that we do. So, but basically that's the answer to that. We don't have scale on the continent, and then on top of that, don't forget that incomes are relatively low. Africa still has now 60% of the world's of the people living in extreme poverty, and again, this is because the economies are not growing. We don't have the scale and so on. So I think the case for trying to look to see continentally how you can achieve scale, I think there's something to be said for that. Recognizing that what you are trying to open up is the trade between SADC and EAC, the trade between SADC and ECOWAS, the trade between SADC and the North, sort of to get the kind of scale that you need. But as part of this networking, the various people who are brought in to give some inspirational or have some inspirational conversations with them, basically about leadership, about ethics, about sort of their own careers, how they could progress in their careers and that sort of thing. And the reason why we are doing this, we recognize that only a handful of Africans are in that program, and the program itself does not guarantee anything. But it's a small gesture to say that you guys, you're privileged, you're at university, like any other African students in university. I see here, I mean, for example, they're all privileged, all of them, just by being at university, because it's not a right across the continent, as you know. So it's a small gesture, but I think a gesture in the right direction for people to be thinking about leadership, not just about the courses that they're doing, but that it's beyond that, beyond what they're learning. Um, yeah, when it comes to thinking about this transition from colonial rule, and beyond, and I think you've painted the pictures, the highlights that you've given different countries and so on. My own view is that where you don't have fully developed institutions, um, as was the case for the countries that were transitioning from colonial rule to the post-colonial rule. The institutions are new, not fully developed, etc. It takes extraordinary leadership to build those institutions, so that the parliaments, the civil service, the banks, and all these things, that they work in the way that they should work. So in the absence of that sort of clear recognition that you're intentionally building institutions, if that is not there, then the whole thing falls apart. And I think this is exactly what has happened. When I went to the Vanderbilt campus and was talking to some colleagues, one of the projects we're looking at doing is exactly on this. Look to see if we can work on policies and institutions as a way of explaining or trying to understand why policy making is so weak and policy making and implementation is so weak, to try to understand the role that institutions play in this in the sort of broader political economy sort of context, of course. So I think that's, part of the explanation. I know that political scientists are better at going more deeply into these issues, and they will talk about having the right coalitions in power. You mentioned Kenya, where a very strong attachment to capitalism in Kenya, which does mean that they do understand, what institutions can make the capitalism work for them. Because, that's very key in Kenya in that sense. So I think that these are the sorts of challenges. And to come back to the young generation, I think they also understand that if you have to have predictability, certainty, and so on, they too have to contribute to building institutions that work. So I think we're in that space now where there's a better understanding. And those leaders that you mentioned that have been outstanding, I think they have understood also the value of institutions, whether it's Mandela, it is Nyerere, even if his economic policies did not quite work, or Kaunda stepping down. I think he understood that that if you want to create a democratic country, you have to step out of the way and let the institution of the presidency and the government take root, so to say. And you mentioned Burkina Faso. These are all people who are trying to experiment with what would work and in a lasting way. So so I think the history of this continent, as you know, is complex, very, very complex. But still, Henry, I insist that we should be optimistic about the continent. I woke up this morning, I see the sun shining. To me, that alone is something that you can celebrate. So let's be optimistic still.
The reasons I'm asking the question is always because we're working with young people. It's easy to walk away. Even now you had Donald Trump saying, if you're Afrikaans, if you've got skills, come to America. And that would cause irreparable damage to South Africa because it's about human capital.
Yeah.
But the actual question that came up when you're speaking was there's sort of this movement, a lot from the African diaspora. They started in Port Louis, Mauritius. You see it in Kigali as well at the moment, Rwanda, and then now sort of the third leg is in Accra and Ghana, of leadership universities. So no longer traditional business schools. Like I think in Mauritius it's called the African Leadership College.
Yeah, yeah.
In Rwanda it's called the African Leadership University. But Kagame now also started the African School of Government
I saw
Leadership.
that, yes.
And I know the African Leadership University is opening up a campus in Accra as well, so sort of a line across the map. I think with the intention of actually creating leaders, teaching leaders in Africa, not to go to, not to become American taught leaders or whatever, although a lot of the inputs will be, and I actually see behind the scenes there's a lot of Moroccan money going into that. So do you think that is a step in the right direction, or would you be cautionary about it?
No, I think all of this helps, in some way or the other. It's not necessarily a bad thing to be thinking about leadership and creating all these learning experiences and opportunities for young people. I saw the one, the Africa School of Governance in Rwanda, which in many ways is ironic. But anyway, there you are. Good intentions behind it. I think that one they're trying to model it after the Lee Kuan Yew school in Singapore. But then, there are similarities between Lee Kuan Yew's leadership in Singapore and Kagame's and so on. So, who's to judge what would on the irony and all this. But I think all of this is helpful in some way or the other. Yeah.
So if the African School of Government phones you and say, well, we want you to come and do a trade policy program for us, would you be willing to move to Kigali?
Actually, I was approached. Actually, I was approached and had a conversation with the provost or director or whoever, Dr. Mugalo. No, where I made some commitments. So I think, and now, now I've made another commitment to NWU. So I think those are two commitments I've made, which are sufficient for the time being. And I want to really try to make sure that we deliver something on those two, especially now with the NWU commitment. Yeah.
So coming to the young people, do you think the future in Africa is Nollywood?
Is Nollywood?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's one aspect of the future of Africa, and it's good. Yeah, I do watch Nollywood films from time to time, as well as the South African ones. And I do this in the family. We always joke that the South African ones, tend to have, two themes. Romance in in some complicated ways, and then some violence.
Telenovelas, really.
Sorry?
Telenovelas, really.
Well, yeah, and then the African one, the Nollywood ones, always an element of some kind of witchcraft, sort of playing out in some ways on these things. But good entertainment, and Netflix gives a platform, for these films to be seen all over the world. So very
Specifically
interesting.
about Nollywood, because I know there's, I think, 5 major studios now, and they're all run from cell phones. They don't have production studios. It's young people with their cell phones making movies.
Absolutely.
The one is actually, one I saw was about alien invasion. I don't know how the hell they did it.
But this is how they're using technology. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And how to unrestrict that. So if you were a 22-year-old who's interested in policy analysis, what would you advise them? How do they get more well-versed? How do they get into it? How do they establish a career? in trade
Yeah,
policy analysis?
I think that you know, again, this came up in one of the discussions we had in the on the Vanderbilt Park campus. It was not intentional to talk about careers, but we did say that in trade policy, you know, of course, because it's a government that leads trade policy, so the opportunities in government, in the civil service, in you know, the sort of diplomatic area as well, since trade negotiations and so on are carried out through you know, foreign ministries, even the, you know, with knowledge of law and all this. So we talked about careers, that economics helps, but also for trade negotiations, international trade law and disciplines like that help. I think also the media is another area where you see a lot of good articles being written about trade, usually in the business pages. You know, clearly people who are well informed or have studied international trade, maybe including here at NWU, you know, but you see some really good articles, thoughtful articles in the media. And also news bulletins, the kind of analysis and the way that journalists who are specialized in trade and business are asking questions and so on. So the media is another important outlet. There are the think tanks as well, where, you know, another area for careers and so on. And then there's also civil society, because increasingly the whole range of civil society organizations that are trying to hold government to account, not just the traditional ones that focus on the social issues, but also the ones that work in the business space, the employers associations. I'm told, for example, you know, for example, that one of the most powerful organizations here in South Africa is the Citrus Growers Association, or whatever it is. I don't know if I'm getting the name right.
Well,
The
they've got, I think that's the overarching body, but
body.
there's like 7 sub
No, the overarching
bodies
one.
under it.
I think the overarching one, that they're quite a very powerful lobby. So, you know, that's what, you know, so civil society includes all of them. So I think, you know, there are all these possibilities, all these avenues, and we need all of them because, again, the way policy making, as you know, is so very complex. You need all these inputs. We need the media to be telling us what's going on and to shine some light, you know, some of the dark corners and so on. So, yeah, so I think, you know, any 22-year-old really has a great opportunity for all of these things. But if I was 22, I would still want to choose the academic route. I think studying these things more deeply, acquiring more knowledge, talking to people like yourself, being stimulated in these conversations, including the ones that we had yesterday. So for me, I think being in the university setting is what I would have chosen, with the opportunity to go work in government and to come back, or in an international organization and come back. You know, that kind of combination, I think, is what I would have chosen. Well, what I chose, and what I think I would still choose if I was 22.
So just off the cuff, would you be willing to do a small 3-pager about what you just said so that we can actually give that to our students?
Sure.
Saying,
Yeah.
especially
Yeah.
if you want to
Yeah.
go in trade policy,
These are
can we just
the sure.
organize
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
That because
We
I
could
think
do
it's
that.
very,
Yeah.
because we
Yeah.
haven't had
Yeah.
something like
Yeah.
that,
Yeah. No,
because
sure. We could do that. Yeah.
most of
Yeah.
our students actually wind up in transportation and logistics.
Yeah.
But as you now know, my specialty, I hate it. No, no, not the industry. I love the people, but the fact that nearly all the students go there because that's sort of an easy, low-hanging fruit. So based on that, I think, so just if you go back to you, you said you would still choose academia, but if you can go back to when you started, what was the one thing you wish you knew then that you know now?
You can't change the world.
You can or can't?
You can't. You can't change the world
No.
overnight, at least. Yeah, it's changes happen incrementally, small, drip by drip by drip by drip. This is unfortunately the way things work. You cannot have these changes overnight. And actually, sometimes when you have drastic changes, the consequences are not good. So in that sense, I've become, if you like, conservative with a small c, just recognizing that changes are incremental.
So you won't be gluing your hand to a road somewhere or...
No, 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 no.
Sorry, I just had to joke about that. So I think I've got two questions left. The one is more personal. So I think let's start off with, if you look at something that I've now seen, especially in working with transportation and logistics, is the role of moving to blockchain-based technologies. Obviously, AI is going to play a role, but the big thing is actually digital currencies. Because, like for instance, the citrus exporters, they have to, in South Africa, they have to pay the shipping companies in dollar. Now, in South Africa, that's a 4-month clearance process with the Reserve Bank. But if you pay them in Bitcoin, you can do it. So, and I don't think we've seen the impact that's going to have. Obviously, there's we don't even have time to go into the trade in illicit goods, the actual biggest economy in the world, part of that, under that. But sort of, if you think about how things go, how can we, first of all, how do you see this developing? And then how can we help this to get trade going in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, certainly technologies, AI, changing, having big impact on everything around us, literally. I think the WTO came out with a report a few months ago on how artificial intelligence is impacting international trade, and with examples that you've just given. And I think of course, the technology is driven by market opportunities. That has always been the case. And we see cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, and all these things emerging in a way as they're trying to circumvent existing constraints. These are all innovations that are looking at existing constraints, like what you mentioned, the Reserve Bank of South Africa, because the way they manage foreign exchange and all this. So people do try to find some other way to get around that, and that's all how it's always been. And I think it's overall, these also innovations are good for economic growth, because the policymakers always lag the market in many ways. Although, of course, they also regulate the market, but the market is always ahead of the policymakers. So I think all these things are good in many ways, but then, of course, you also need to ensure that you have the regulations, institutions that can ensure that we don't have a disaster, basically. Myself, being quite skeptical of cryptocurrency and so on. But they seem to, at least for the time being, they seem to be working. But I remain skeptical. Let's see how all that evolves.
Okay, so my last question to you. You grew up in Sierra Leone,
Yes.
but you haven't lived in Sierra Leone for a long time, but you still have strong family ties. So if I ask you, how do I know somebody's from Sierra Leone?
How do you know?
Not Liberian, not
Yeah.
from Guinea.
Yeah. Okay. One way that you can know is by our names. I think in Liberia and Sierra Leone, people from Freetown, which is where I'm from, people from Liberia, from Monrovia, we have these English-sounding names.
Like
Partly,
Luke.
Yes, like Luke. Yes, yeah, because our ancestors took these names for various reasons. Some is for many of us also ancestors were involved in the transatlantic slave trade, and so these are people who came back to live in Africa, and that's why it's called Freetown, because it was, it's created as a city for people who came out of the transatlantic slave trade to come back and live in Africa. The same with Liberia. It's called Liberia. It means liberty.
Yeah.
Basically, that's the history. So for some of us from that part of West Africa, and by the way, there's also very strong sort of descendants, the same people in places like Lagos. You find all along the West African coast people who carry these sorts of names that we do. So yeah, so that's one way that you can tell where we are from. And I'm glad you asked this question because it gives an opportunity to show how complex the history of this continent is. It's really very complex. And yes, I've not lived in Sierra Leone since I was 18, actually. I always joke that people like yourself is better Africans than I am, because at least you have been here all the time, much more so than I have been. I think this is just human, sort of what we as humans, how complex all of our histories are. And that gives me an appreciation. My own children live in the US and in Canada. As far as they're concerned, that is where they belong, and so on. So there are all these complexities that we are as human beings, and our ancestors have moved around and helped to shape the societies in which we come from, and so on. So I have a great appreciation of that, and I think it's something really to be celebrated. And also it gives me great respect for other communities that I see that have had a similar evolution, including Islamic communities say in West Africa and so on. And I know the history, and even as far away as coming from with ancestors coming from the Gulf, the Middle East, and so on. It just gives you an appreciation of how we're all a product of how things have evolved historically. So it's something to celebrate. Actually, I've always felt.
So then lastly, how would you describe the difference? Like you said, Nigerians, I can spot a Nigerian a million miles away. They're like parrots, they're the brightest.
Yeah.
The Ghanaians to me are sort of similar, but a bit more subdued. But if you think about Sierra Leone, because I'm trying to sort of once again get us into the African mindset, the difference of doing things in Sierra Leone versus Liberia. Why shouldn't it just be one country?
Well, you can't change the boundaries, that have been established. That's one thing you can change. I think those are there. But the good thing is we can say that we are Africans. So despite we have different accents and all these things, but geographically, this is where we can trace where we belong. Yeah.
So me traveling from South Africa, and I wake up, how do I know I'm in Freetown, not in Monrovia?
Uh, well, at least you would have your passport with you. There's a stamp that tells you exactly which country you're in. But the point is well taken that so many similarities. You find the same thing, by the way, in Europe. Traveling across Europe, especially traveling by train across Europe. Sometimes when you cross the border. Recently, I traveled on the Channel Tunnel from London to Brussels, and of course, you go through Paris you go through France. You don't even know when you've left France or when you have entered Belgium, except you get a small bing on your phone that tells you that the satellite now knows where you are. You are in a different place. So I mean, I think this. These are the things which we have to live with.
So do you have any concluding thoughts you would like to share with
No,
NWU staff, students?
yeah, no, just to say that I've been delighted to be here. Really, the hospitality has been amazing. But this is what you expect when you come to Africa. The hospitality is truly amazing. I take very seriously the honor of being appointed an extraordinary professor here, and really would like to use this in a way that would leave some legacy. To me, this is very important. So with that, I think we want to work to see how to do some things that would have an impact. So we'll be working on that.
Professor David Luke,
Yes.
welcome to South Africa.
Yes, Henry,
Thank you.
thank you very much. Thank you.